Recently, I did a post on hikikomori, who usually live at home with parents and lead quite an isolated life. But every time I talk about that, I run the risk of pathologizing multi-generational households. Now, I don't mean to be doing that. And in fact, adult children living at home with parents is really pretty common. In this post, let's take a look at some of the data on that phenomenon. I'm in Canada, so let's start there, and I'll use some Statistics Canada data. In 1981, 42% of Canadians 20 to 24 years old lived in their parental home. By 2011, this had gone up to 59%. Now that's a 17% rise in the numbers overall, but a 40% rise over and above those 1981 figures. That's a pretty big trend. What about the 25 to 29 age group? In 1981, it was 11%, about 1 in 10 living at home with at least one parent. By 2011, it was 23%. Another 12% were doing it, but expressed as a proportion of those in 1981, it was 109% higher. It had more than doubled. So even in 1981, it wasn't uncommon, but we're seeing these very significant trends for people in their 20s to live with their parents. And who's doing it? There's still a gender imbalance in earning, even amongst young people, with males earning more. So obviously, it's going to be the women who live at home, right? In fact, not true. In 2011, 55% of young women in Canada, 20 to 24, lived at home. But 64% of men and 20% of women 25 to 29 lived at home versus 29% of men. And this is a trend that we see all over the world. Men generally earn more on average, so we should see them being more able to afford to move out. In fact, they move out less. What about in the United States? Well, different countries use different age bands and different measurements, so they're hard to compare. But in the 1980 census, 54.3% of men from 18 to 24 lived with a parent. Now you'd think, way back in 1980, we weren't so progressive. So then women would be surely more likely to be at home. Nope, it was 42.7%. So this idea of men more likely to be at home with the Rellies was present even then. In 2018, it stayed pretty steady in the USA. Men, 57.8%. Women, 51.9%. A slight increase for the men, more for the women, but still fewer overall than the guys. How about 25 to 34-year-olds in the United States? In 1980, 10.5% of males and 7% of females lived at home. In 2018, this is nearly doubled for both groups. 20.8% of males, 12.8% of females. So after almost 40 years of enormous social change and economic development, there's no sign that people are moving on with their lives any earlier. And in fact, the data points to delays in launching from the parental home in these age groups. Okay, what about globally? In a lot of countries, living at home with your parents, at least until marriage, and often after, is pretty normative. In the OECD's Society at a Glance Report 2016, there are figures for the number of young adults 15 to 29 living with their parents. Now, I think this age band obviously goes a bit low because, of course, most 15 to 18-year-olds are going to be at home. But still, it gives you an idea. In Italy, it's 80.6%. In Greece, 76.3%. In Portugal, 75%. Poland, 68.2%. UK, about 52%. And in all cases, it's more young men than young women. So living at home isn't really all that unusual, and it can't be taken as the same thing as hikikomori. It isn't. People live at home for all kinds of reasons. One is societal norms. If, as in Italy, it's the usual thing, you may not experience any sense of urgency to set up a place of your own. Another factor is the job market. When unemployment rates are high, more people just lack the funds that they require in order to move out. Another factor is the cost of housing. In the US, rates of living at home with parents are highest in the South and in the Northeast, where housing costs can often be quite high. More people live outside the family home in the Midwest, where the costs are often lower. And there's another factor, earning power. Over the last 35 years, the earnings of young adults in terms of buying power haven't really gone up very much. Wages are higher, but so are costs. And if you equalize based on inflation, a young adult today is barely better off than his or her equivalent in 1981. And for young men in Canada, real earning power decreased for most of that period, recovering only after 2008. Young women tended to hold steadier, and in older age groups, women have been increasing in buying power, though they still haven't caught up to same-aged men. Given that young men tend to earn more than young women, why don't they leave home to at least the same amount? Why is it young women who are more independent when they make less money? It's an open question. But I wonder if the answer isn't sexism. And I know I'm on dangerous ground here, so please, bear with me. But despite all of our change in the last 35 years, young women are still more likely to be taught basic domestic skills like cooking and cleaning and taking care of themselves. Young men, on average, not everybody, don't get quite as much of that. Now, I tell the story in my new book of a woman who told me that her son, the little prince, was off to a university dorm, and she was worried because he'd never used a washing machine in his entire life. He won't know how, she says. Now, that's not a story that you often hear about somebody's daughter. This poor kid is completely unprepared. And if that's true, that is potentially sexism in action. Women are being raised more than men as though we expect them to be housewives. But there's a paradox. When they get to be age 20, the women know how to take care of themselves. Get them an apartment, they'll live. But the young men, they'll starve to death. All the basic skills you need to survive in your own apartment are things that their sisters get taught more than them. So is that it? I don't know, but I kind of think that's part of it. This isn't an argument, obviously, against teaching girls how to cook and do the laundry and clean the place up. It's an argument to teach the boys exactly the same things. Because until they know those things, they're going to be helpless. You can get How to Be Miserable from your local bookseller or from Amazon. The link's below.